looks like participation's starting to level off, though still trickling in. So we'll go ahead and kick things off. Well, thank you everyone for joining our Opportunity Zones webinar, the latest in our series. We are really excited to have two wonderful guest speakers, Al Puhala, Capstone Investments, and Howard Weil from ICIC, to talk about assessing the impact of Opportunity Zones investments and how they are going about that in their work. So we'll go to the next slide. And of course, as always, I'm joined by our wonderful moderator, Rachel Riley at Aces and Archers as well, who I will turn it over to momentarily. In terms of our agenda, we will first start off, as we always do, with OZ resources and market updates. We will go into then a topic overview on systems and methods for identifying impact and monitoring compliance. Then we will hear from our two guest speakers and their presentations. Finally, we will leave some open Q&A with the attendees at the end of the webinar. So as always, please feel free to use the Q&A function, ideally not the chat. That can get sometimes a little busy, and it means that we miss your questions. We want to make sure we hear all your questions and can address them at the end. So please use the Q&A function on the webinar to submit your questions throughout the presentations. And we will make sure to address them at the end. A couple of other housekeeping notes before I get right into the updates. This is being recorded, so we will be posting the recording as well as a recap of this conversation on our website within probably a couple of weeks or so. If you have registered and are attending now, you will get an email with that information as soon as that is live and published on our site. And I think with that, we can move over to the updates. All right, so I first want to call out a new Opportunity Zones resource. The Sorensen Impact Center released its updated version of the Rural Opportunity Zone and Recovery Playbook. This is a really fantastic resource. It includes case studies, stakeholder lists, resources, step-by-step, really detailed guide for how to attract private investment to communities and for community priorities. This is not just specific to Opportunity Zones, although certainly OZs have kind of presented a helpful blueprint for how some communities have done this really well and kind of convened a lot of stakeholders together to attract capital to their communities and to their economic development priorities. So it does take a central role, but I think is more broadly applicable, certainly. It includes talking about how to build your team, what other tools to use that are in your especially local toolbox, and how to connect with investors, among other chapters in this guide. So highly recommend you check it out. As soon as I am finished going through the updates, I will be putting links to all of this information in the chat so that you can access that directly. I also wanted just to continue to call out the Opportunity Zones legislation that was introduced earlier this year in April, of the OZIA Transparency Extension and Improvement Act. So that legislation is still live. We are still working on gaining additional support for that, but it has some very important provisions in there, namely reporting requirements to get a full scope of what is happening, a full picture of what is happening in the market across the country, and also requires the Treasury and IRS to work with other agencies to produce a kind of longitudinal study on the effectiveness of the policy on the communities that were designated as well. So definitely relevant to our conversation today on how we're monitoring impact. The legislation would go a long way to helping those efforts, not only to kind of track reporting and compliance, but also that the information needed to gather the effectiveness of the policy and how it may need to be improved in the future. We've also done a webinar on this that goes into the provisions included. That's one of many provisions in the legislation. So we've done a webinar that goes through all of those in great detail and includes representatives from Senator Scott's office who introduced the bill with Senator Booker. So we can post that in the chat as well for your reference. Next slide. Thanks, Amelia. Great. So a few OZ stories before I hand it over to Rachel to provide our topic overview. Just wanted to go through a couple of notable new stories or commentary on opportunity zones. So the first is the 66-acre DC campus at Walter Reed. It is going to, when finished, have 3.1 million square feet of development as well. Essentially, wanted to point this out because the economic circumstances have certainly been challenging for developments, especially ones of this scale, with rising interest rates, among other issues. And the project sponsor was quoted as saying that the OZ designation essentially was instrumental to being able to continue to attract capital even amidst some of these more challenging circumstances. So I thought that was pretty notable. Now that project is 70% either completed or under construction. And there was just a recent groundbreaking, I think even just maybe last week or a couple weeks ago, for about 300 new units in Washington, D.C., which, as many communities across the country are experiencing, is certainly has a limited supply of housing. And so it's good to see that Opportunity Zones has been a really important component of increasing the housing supply within this tight market. Another piece of commentary I wanted to highlight is by Senator Mike Crapo, who is the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, the committee of relevant jurisdiction to tax policy and therefore opportunity zones. He spoke about again housing supply issues in Idaho, where the state he represents. And called out opportunity zones among other financing tools like the low-income housing tax credit, zoning, kind of relooking at zoning laws and other kind of innovations that really should be thought about and leveraged to expand housing affordability and also increasing the supply of housing within the state. And then finally, wanted to make folks aware of a new opportunity. So the U.S. Department of Transportation recently released a notice of funding opportunity for their Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation SMART grants. This grant program was established in bipartisan infrastructure law earlier this year. It is a $100 million grant program appropriated annually through 2026. The public sector agencies are those that are eligible to apply. And essentially the goal behind the SMART grant is to demonstrate or to help pilot projects on advanced smart community technology and systems to improve efficiency and safety. And the reason we call this out is because the grant encourages applicants to locate their projects in federally designated community development zones, including opportunity zones that support historically disadvantaged communities. And I'll say that notice of funding opportunity is open through November 18th. So if you are within that realm and potentially able to apply, I did want to note that. And it's great that opportunity zones is one of the kind of prioritized zones or a place where they're really kind of hoping that applicants will encourage to put their projects there. All right, I think that goes through the updates, takes us through all the updates. And with that, I will turn it over to Rachel. And you'll see some activity in the chat here where I will post all of the links that I just mentioned in the chat here momentarily.
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine. So this is one of my favorite topics. It's the intersection between data and opportunity zones. And so it covers a bunch of things, including, how we're using data to understand the characteristics of opportunity zones to make investments that are aligned with the highest and best use and original intent of the policy. And then how post-investment we are using data to stay in compliance and benchmark impact to ensure that, the opportunity zone ecosystem is running smoothly, and also that we have models for high impact activities that can be financed with OZ investments. And so I kind of ran through that really quickly, but just to underscore the points that I'm making here. So, first and foremost, data is being used to understand the characteristics of the tracks. And so We've been seeing data used to baseline existing conditions so that when folks are trying to measure long-term impact, they have a baseline to start with, right? And so we're seeing data used there, but also to identify local needs. And so whether that's retail leakage or shadow housing demand, folks are using data to try to understand where they can make investments and have the highest value proposition, and where those OZ investments can really move the needle in terms of follow-on activity. And then determining how investments will impact a community. Obviously, we would love to hope and believe that people are taking a first do no harm approach to making these investments. And I think a lot of that is understanding how and if their investment may impact displacement of existing businesses and residents, and then solving for that. We've heard about that in Cincinnati, where the developers at the Willcomen, they knew that they were going to have to update some of the facades and interiors of the small businesses, and before displacing them, which may force them to go out of business, they found new space for them. And so it's understanding what your impact will be, and then ensuring that you're helping to be a part of that solution. And then we're also hearing a lot of opportunity funds and fund managers using impact screens. A lot of times we talk about ESG screens when we talk about impact investing, and it's basically the same thing, but identifying where you want to have an impact. And then as you're seeing deal opportunities come through your pipeline, using a screen to determine where the highest and best use of your investment dollars may go based on those long-term impacts you're hoping to have. And part of that process, again, is identifying those data points. And that's also then helpful when over the long term, you're trying to track post-investment activity and impact. And so those are the data points that you're going to want to be monitoring over the long term. And of course, post-investment activity, measuring and monitoring the impact of an OZ investment, as I just mentioned, and then also staying in compliance with federal statute and regulations. So both of our guest speakers today are going to talk about all of those topics. I'm really excited to have both Alan and Howard here. But before I turn it over to Howard, who's going to kick us off, I do just want to note a few examples of where we're seeing this at work. So folks may have heard us talk about CEI, their partnership with Bullis, which is a real estate firm, and Wood Forest Bank. They all joined together to create an opportunity fund. It was a $20 million fund that they've since closed with, I believe, more than 10 projects. But throughout that process, they were doing impact screening, as I mentioned, and they also had an advisory council who would look at the deals that were coming through their pipeline. And I believe they said that they reviewed nearly 250 investments and picked, the top ones that would have the highest impact. So hopefully they will be able to raise more money and get to those other 240 deals, but really excited to see what they've been up to and thrilled to share their methodology there. We can go to the next slide. Similarly, RevOz Capital, they are now Revitate. So in case you hear Revitate, just know that that's formerly known as RevOz. But they came out with an announcement about a year ago, maybe early 2021, so more than a year ago, that they were going to dedicate their investment strategy to generating $1 billion in social investment. And they went a long way in leveraging an impact screening card or scorecard in order to evaluate their deals. I know that there were definitely deals in their pipeline that they ultimately passed on because it didn't meet the threshold of impact that they were hoping to achieve. And then they also established an advisory council, social impact council, which they used frequently to get insights on how they can best deploy their capital and position their projects to support the community. I think my last slide here is if this is a subject that feels a little familiar, it's because we do talk about this a lot and we've covered it in previous webinars. This is meant to be an update to the webinar that we hosted in November of 2020, where we had JTC Americas and Catalyst Opportunity Fund join us. And so in case folks don't know, JTC Americas is an OZ fund administrator that is not only handling the back office for opportunity funds, but they are also integrating an impact monitoring and articulation tool that opportunity fund managers can leverage in addition to their back office and administration services. And then Catalyst Opportunity Fund spoke about their impact screening process. And so if folks want to go back or didn't have an opportunity to catch that webinar, we have a link to it. I believe it's going to be in the chat momentarily. I also want to say that Chicagoland Opportunity Zone Consortium is hosting a webinar series from October through January, and the first webinar is on the 25th. And during that webinar, they're also going to be talking about engaging funds, fund managers, and investors. And a lot of that discussion will be around the importance of articulating impact to investors. So this is a topic that everyone really cares about, and we're excited to be able to shine the spotlight on folks that are in it with us for that reason. Let me go to the next slide. And from here, I'm going to turn it over to Howard.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I'm Howard Weil, Senior Vice President and Director of Research at ICIC, the Initiative for a Competitive Intercity. Next slide, please. So I want to talk today about the Opportunity Zone evaluation work that we have been doing in partnership with Arctaris Impact Investors. But let me start with a few words about ICIC. ICIC, the Initiative for a Competitive Intercity, is a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to creating inclusive prosperity in under-resourced communities to create jobs, income, and wealth for community residents. And although our name has the term inner city in it, we actually work in a wide range of under-resourced communities in large and small cities, in suburbs, and even somewhat in rural areas. So we're quite diverse in our geographic focus. We are what you might call a think and do tank. We conduct research and run small business technical assistance programs to try to help small businesses located in under-resourced communities grow. We have 7 small business technical assistance programs dedicated to various types of businesses. And our research is done in collaboration with and for the benefit of public, private, nonprofit, and community decision makers to try to help them respond to the pressing economic development challenges that under-resourced communities face. And our research includes evaluation, which of course is the topic of my presentation today. Next slide, please. So ICIC's involvement with Opportunity Zones goes back almost to the very beginning of Opportunity Zones. In 2019, I wrote a policy brief that lays out 4 basic principles that we at ICIC believe should guide Opportunity Zone investments. First, they should be focused on places that are in real need. We all know by now that not all Opportunity Zones are created equal. Second, they should focus largely, although not entirely, on operating businesses other than real estate businesses, because those are the ones that can create the most economic growth in under-resourced communities. Third, they should be in accordance with public and community priorities, including especially the priorities of the residents of Opportunity Zones. And finally, they should be transparent and accountable. Those 4 basic principles have guided all of ICIC's work around Opportunity Zones, including the work that I'll talk about with Arctaris today. And as an example of some of our rural work, in 2020, we developed an Opportunity Zone prospectus for 17 counties in rural Southern Illinois. And that prospectus development process not only helped market Opportunity Zones in those areas to potential investors, but it also helped educate local economic developers and policymakers from an economic development perspective about how opportunity zones work and help them turn projects that they were interested in and that had large-scale community support into potentially investable opportunity zone projects. Arctaris Impact Investors invests in opportunity zones and other low and moderate income geographic areas throughout the country. Most, although certainly not all of their investments, are in operating businesses. And we and Arctaris are completely in accord on our basic values and priorities. What we do for Arctaris is to provide them with independent advice and analysis on impact measurement and reporting. And we work with them to develop metrics and, as I'll mention in a few minutes, a survey to measure how Arctaris's investments are performing on broad economic, social, and environmental impact goals that Arctaris has set. Not financial goals, that's something that every investment firm, including Arctaris, does for itself. But we are concerned about working with them to measure economic, social, and environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So the core of our work with Arctaris is an annual impact survey. We work closely with Arctaris to develop metrics, translate those into survey questions for the companies in which Arctaris invests. We've been doing that since 2019, and we've used that to help contribute to Arctaris's annual impact report in 2020 and in 2021, and we'll do so again in the coming year. Our survey includes questions that help Arctaris evaluate economic, social, and environmental impacts. So we ask about company ownership and management and employment, not only in terms of numbers of people, but also in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, veteran status of owners, managers, and employees. We ask about wages and salaries, not just for the average or typical employee, but also for the lowest paid employees to determine whether the lowest paid employees are benefiting from the company's growth strategies that are fueled by Arctaris's investments. We ask about a range of employee benefits, including but not limited to retirement and healthcare. And finally, we ask about a range of environmentally sustainable practices. And critically, we benchmark each company's performance against industry and regional averages. That's what we've been doing every year and will continue to do. In the last couple of years, we also did a couple of additional pieces of analysis for Arctaris. We did some in-depth interviews with key company leaders for selected companies to find out how Arctaris's investments were playing out for them and how they might improve their operations and their social impact in the future. And then last year, we did an economic impact analysis of Arctaris's investment in the ski lodge at Saddleback Mountain in Maine. And the point of that analysis was to look at the overall job impact of the investment, not just the jobs that were created at Saddleback when it reopened as a result of Arctaris's investment, but also the jobs that were created at local suppliers and those that were created because of employee spending in the local area. So that's an overview of some of what we've done. As I said, Arctaris uses the findings as the basis of its annual impact report. We've done that for the last couple of years, and we'll continue to do that in the coming year. Next slide. So some of our key findings. First, Arctaris's investments have done quite well in terms of increasing minority ownership and senior management representation. Share of Arctaris portfolio companies that were either certified minority owned or eligible to be certified minority owned grew substantially, as did the average share of senior managers who are minorities. Arctaris did extremely well during the pandemic. A across the entire portfolio of companies that were present in both 2019 and 2021, there was no net job loss. And in 2021, a year when the pandemic was still raging, half of all of the Arcturus portfolio companies retained employees on their payroll, even if there was not enough work for them. And finally, most portfolio companies are making meaningful efforts to hire locally. The average share of employees who live and work in the same zip code grew by almost 50% in between 2020 and 2021. Next slide, please. On wages and benefits, the average of the lowest wage, that is the lowest hourly wage offered by Arcturus companies, grew by nearly 5% from 2019 to 2021, adjusted for inflation. And remember, back in those days, the inflation rate wasn't nearly as high as it is today. And the 4.9% post-inflation growth rate was really quite outstanding. And Arcturus portfolio companies are more likely to offer health and retirement benefits than are their counterparts in the nation as a whole. And on our environmental sustainability, another key concern of ours and of Arcturus's, half of the portfolio companies told us that they have specific sustainability practices in place to reduce energy use. And we're also tracking the amount of solar energy generated by Arcturus portfolio companies. The solar is a particular concern of Arcturus. Next slide, please. So what do we?
Howard, I think you may have muted yourself.
I'm
Accidentally.
unmuted.
There you go.
I'm muted now, I hope, right?
We can hear you now. Yeah.
Good, thanks. What do we learn from our work with Arcturus in doing what is still a very, very new type of opportunity zone evaluation, evaluation at the level of the individual company in an investment portfolio, rolled up then into the portfolio, the level of the portfolio as a whole. First, it's important to set clear impact goals. We work very closely with Arcturus throughout the entire evaluation process to understand their impact goals, translate them into metrics, and put them into our survey in a way that companies could understand. Second, doing the kind of evaluation that we did, that we are continuing to do, is an iterative process that requires flexibility and constant adjustment. We work closely with Arcturus to fine-tune our survey and our reporting methods. And finally, we recognize that investment firms are not researchers or evaluators, so we designed our data collection to make it easy for Arcturus to access and understand the impact of their investments at both the individual company level and the level of their entire investment portfolio. So that's a summary of the innovative work that we've been doing with Arcturus and that we hope to continue in the future. I'll pause now and take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Howard. And just as a reminder for folks, feel free to enter questions in the Q&A box, and we can take those throughout the presentation. We'll have formal Q&A at the end. But Howard, as always, I have a few questions for you, and folks feel free to jump in if you have questions specifically for Howard at this time. So I guess my first question really revolves around storytelling, because there's, we talk a lot, and especially recently, about the importance of storytelling and being able to say that OZ Capital has truly created an impact in communities. And so outside of the annual report, do you see a path forward, or can you share with folks how you think Arcturus could potentially use the data you collected, the qualitative and quantitative data you collected, to tell their story about how they're impacting communities?
Well, I can't say what will happen in the future, but Arcturus has really done an excellent job so far in telling its story, taking selected data points with our advantage and pulling them out and weaving them into a broader narrative. And they've also used the deep dive interviews that we've done to present a more detailed and more human picture of just what it is that they are accomplishing with their investments at the individual company level. So those are some examples of what they've done so far, and will likely continue in the future.
Yeah, and that's great. And I love the idea of doing these deep dive interviews because you are very likely to get some great quotes, right? That could be used in op-eds or in any sort of news coverage that maybe you want to share or work with. But one of the questions that we just got was, how can the stories be told by those who live in OZ communities? And I have some thoughts on that, but Howard, I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an area that we have not gotten into yet with Arcturus, but will probably become increasingly important in the future as the results of these investments become more and more apparent to the residents of local communities. So there, I think it's important to engage local leaders, community leaders, local policymakers, and tell the stories to them. And we have in the impact reports of Arcturus, some good material for that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in some ways having these deep dive interviews almost primes folks to be thinking about the impact that's being generated. And so maybe it's a business owner that you have that initial conversation with them, and then you circle back around with the data that you found and say, could you write an op-ed, or would you be willing to do a joint op-ed with us? And Howard, I know you can't speak for Arcturus, but to Paul's question, that's really how I see that playing out. And then, as Howard mentioned, communicating the data points to local leaders and elected officials is just hugely important. And having the stamp of, we did this impact survey or impact analysis with really solid methodologies behind it, I think is really important as well. Third-party evaluations, of course. Matt Tui has a question, and Howard, I don't know if you can speak to this, but you did talk about how much of Arcturus's portfolio is concentrated in operating businesses. So the question is, what percentage of the investments were used to purchase the business? And what were the main factors that drove the percentage up from 26 to over 40% for the individuals involved?
I can't really speak to those details. Those are that's really more of an Arcturus question than an IC question.
Yeah, Matt, I'd be happy. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Howard.
We do know that the majority, more than 50% of the investments that were highlighted in the most recent impact report were in operating businesses. But of course, the portfolio is constantly changing. Arcturus does invest in real estate and other types of projects that are not operating businesses, but their emphasis has been, at least so far, in operating businesses.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Matt, I'd be happy if you're not already in touch with the folks at Arcturus to connect you. Just reach out to me afterwards. And I would imagine that the jump from 26 to over 40% probably represents intentionality from Arcturus in developing a pipeline. And so it's just seeing that pipeline develop over time, and then the transactions close. Maybe the pipeline wasn't that deep in 2019, but over 2020 and 2021, they developed a more solid pipeline of minority-owned businesses that then gets you to 40% closing in the most recent year. So, wild guess. All right. Well, thank you so much, Howard. Please stick around. I know that there's some additional questions here that we want to get to during the open Q&A session, but I want to introduce Al from Capstone, who's going to talk about Capstone's work on not only with investing, but Capstone Analytics and how you guys are hoping to build networks and leverage data to improve the ecosystem.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank EIG and Catherine, Rachel specifically. When I wake up, every morning and think that, over 30 million people in these communities are counting on us all in this ecosystem to get it right, I get very excited. And I think with Catherine and Rachel and everyone at EIG's leadership, we wouldn't be here today without the organization. So thank you very much for all you have done and will do to make this asset class very successful. Next slide, please. So Capstone was set up in early 2018. I had spent most of my career on Wall Street at several firms and also a PE investor for about 35 years. And when I saw the law, I said, this is transformational for America, because what it does, it allows us all to come together by sector, by growth stage of company, and focus on the community needs. So that the unique aspect of this asset class is that in the census tract, that polygon, any investment, if properly structured, can get both impact that's measurable, if you can measure it, but also comes together as a solution. So it's not a point solution, it's a holistic solution. We as a country focus on sectors like tech housing, solar ITC, or on demographics. If you're homeless, there's a program. If you're a veteran, there's a program. If you're a student, there's a program. What the zones have done in a unique manner, I think in American history, is organize the location to be the recipient. And what that means, though, is a challenge for all of us in the investment community and the local stakeholder community to bring that all together. So that's what Capstone really was set up to be. In early 2018, I think we were one of the first co-ops in the country in Connecticut to form. And we put together the solution both for investors, for funds, and for the local stakeholders, including businesses and the public sector. So we're very excited about doing this nationally. We focus in the real estate sector on workforce housing and also on government-related real estate. It could be the government as a tenant, could be the government as the local anchor, a military base or otherwise. But in addition, we're focusing on the non-real estate sectors. Very importantly, sustainable and resilient infrastructure, could be energy infrastructure, solar and wind, could be data infrastructure with data centers, could be water infrastructure. These are all very, very important sectors for this country to be rebuilt. And most importantly, because in the end, these are low-income communities. These are people who need jobs and economic activity. We focus on the businesses. So it's a wrap. They all come together, and we try to make sure that community is the beneficiary of our approach. Next slide, please. So what did we decide to do as our core offering? And it really is Capstone Analytics. Just by chance, I'm sitting here in Dallas, Texas, where Capstone Analytics is headquartered in the Deep Ellum Opportunity Zone in Dallas with my colleagues. There are about 8 of us in the room. So I may call on one of them to join the webinar if there's a hard question posed by us. And what we decided is, because this is such a different type of program, I once ran a small business investment company. The SBA had me licensed and certified. This is not that. You must do it correctly, and many years in the future, prove that you've done it correctly. And therefore, it's all about compliance and data and making sure that you have the right platform of all those aspects. So it's a very fast growing sector. We estimate there are 20,000 qualified opportunity funds today with approximately $180 billion. It's very, very large in only 5 years to have grown to this level. And what we believe is Capstone Analytics is in our portfolio. We've invested in Capstone Analytics. It services our investments, and we've invested several tens of millions of dollars. But more importantly, it's a service offering for the market. We want to make sure everyone can benefit from the work we're doing at Capstone Analytics. So what does Capstone Analytics do? Even before an investment is made, it's a resource to figure out what location would be best for my facility or a workforce housing build. What does the community think? Does the community want that solution, or is it really not in the best interest in long term? And most importantly, we believe it's provable ESG. Most ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is done in the public markets because that's where the liquidity is. It's very hard to do it in the private markets. Well, lo and behold, opportunity zones solve that because it's provable ESG. It's census data. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. That data is used to apportion our representatives for the most important democracy in history. It's good enough for Capstone Analytics. So we use census data, and we also use the IRS filing data as it will come out, anonymized, of course, to prove with that subsidized investment, the government is offering that benefit to investors. What is the impact for that community? For incomes, for poverty rates, and also for many other aspects like health outcomes. So we believe it really is the best data available, and Capstone Analytics is based on that data. Number two, during the investment process, how could you use Capstone Analytics? Well, number one, it's very important to partner with the local stakeholders. We start there. We make sure that over the long term, this is an investment or an approach that the local community desires. It will not be successful, and it will not be good for the community if that's not the case. So that's where things start. Is the investment good for the community? And then there's a lot of technical stuff that happens. What happens to the cash flows? What happens to the distributions, the recycling of money if you need? Those are all aspects of monitoring compliance. And by the way, there are many, many interested parties in making sure an investment is successful. The other vendors in the legal and accounting world, fund administration, Capstone Analytics helps that whole community come together to make sure, at least in our case, that our investments are compliant, will stay compliant, and are good for the community. And most importantly, over the long term, and remember, this program ends in 2047, 25 years from now, there's going to be a lot of monitoring of those investments and decision-making of when to refinance, when to sell, when to merge. We believe that Capstone Analytics will have that solution available for any stakeholders in the market, but most importantly, will allow investors and their partners to get ahead of problems. So during the year, on a monthly basis, Capstone Analytics generates information to help someone remediate an issue that, frankly, if not caught early, may only be an issue of what is the penalty. We'd like to have any of our partners in the market be able to have the tools to get ahead of problems, and most importantly, over the long term, be able to help the community through ESG and impact reporting. So this is the best data because it's driven through a compliance platform. Next slide, please. One example of one of our real estate investments is a workforce housing 200-unit facility in New London, Connecticut. It was one of the largest investments in Connecticut, but most importantly, it really was desired by the community. This is an area that has a huge need for housing. General Dynamics will be building the next class of nuclear submarines. They want a $20 billion Navy contract. There's very little housing. So we decided to focus on the partnership with the local community, find a site, find developers, find co-investors, and we will be in very short order, in a few months, finished with construction and providing workforce housing for that community that really needs it. I'll say lastly, and then we can go to questions, that Capstone Analytics is very, very integral to our approach, because during the construction period, moving into the fully leased up period, Capstone Analytics gives us the comfort as investors that we're in compliance, that we're measuring the impact on the community, and we're helping the entire community benefit from our investment. So that's my presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, you have a question here from Patrick. It asks, how early in the process of a project do you advise Capstone Analytics to get involved with a developer sponsor?
So we see our relationship with stakeholders in the market as an ongoing relationship. We would like to invest the time and effort early on to work with the best-in-class developers, with the local community leaders, with military bases, with universities, the local parties that really help define what should happen. So I would say very early, please reach out to us. If there's not a commercial relationship that's appropriate right now, we still will invest the time and effort to hear what the needs are. And over time, we would hope that all communities in the country can benefit from Opportunity Zone capital.
That's great. And there's a few follow-up questions. And I think you just alluded to it, but do you have a particular deal size that's too small? Like how big should a deal be for folks that want to reach out and engage your services?
Right. So we are a co-op. Our investments have ranged from at the low end, a couple of $1 million to the high end of about 25 million. That's the equity size. As we all know, in the real estate or fixed asset world, you can double or triple that capital with the debt or grants. That would be where we as investors really would see where we could add the most value. But Capstone Analytics services the entire range of sizes of investors. So if you're a small investor or large investor, corporate investor, individual investor, we want to talk to you. So please reach out to us. And again, if there's not a commercial relationship right now, we still want to hear from you to build a long-term relationship to help these communities.
And then the final follow-up question to that is, what is the pricing for the resources and services that you're providing? Is there menu of prices that you can share?
I'm happy to put you in touch with Jonathan Ewart, who's my partner and CEO of Capstone Analytics. We want to make sure that everyone can benefit from our services. So we would have a discussion with any interested parties.
Awesome. Thanks, Al. Do you mind putting that information in the chat? I think you could probably type it in the chat. Or Patrick, let Al know the best way to reach out to you.
Sure, I'll make sure my information, and we also have our website, Capstone Impact Investments, and also Capstone Analytics is standing up a website. So I guarantee you, if you reach Rachel or Catherine, they will find us, and we are active nationally. So again, any folks, public, private sector, large or small, we want to be your partner. We want to help all communities access this capital, and we'll help you do that.
Yeah, excellent. Let us know, Patrick, what you need there. And then another question for you, Al. Any work in food processing or distribution?
We think that's a very, very high focus and priority sector. Food is something that we of course obviously need all the time. The system is part of the largest supply chain problem right now, right? Getting healthy food into the communities that need it. The food deserts that abound throughout the cities. We want to be a resource to help people address that. So one of the interesting things about Opportunity Zones is a sector does not have to stand on its own. Often there's a transformational investment. It could be a data center. It could be a university facility. But around it, then many other sectors can be supported. So we see food distribution and even production. It doesn't have to be even rural. It could be, vertical farming. These are all sectors that we have ongoing discussions with. So please, if you think there's a sector like food distribution or production, zones can help. The key, of course, is always the investment in a zone. If it's real estate, fairly obvious, right? The asset is there, and then the economic activity, right? The people being hired during the construction and monitoring stage are there. Operating businesses, even asset-based operating businesses, really require much more complex, monitoring and compliance to make sure that people you're hiring who are out of the zone are still within the ratio. So food production is one of those sectors that we really have thought a lot about, and we believe we have a solution for it.
Great. Well, while we await any other questions coming through from the audience, Al, I wanted to ask you, we talked at the beginning of this webinar about the OZ Transparency Extension and Improvement Act, which would add in reporting requirements and transparency requirements, for both funds and investors. So I wanted to just get your take on what would be required in the legislation if that passed, and also how Capstone would be able to potentially help, funds and investors in tracking some of that information and keeping folks in compliance with a more robust reporting regime.
No, thank you, Catherine. No, we're very big proponents of the pending legislation. We think it's good for the program. We actually are speaking to many large investors, institutional investors, asset managers, insurance companies who, based on the law passing, we believe will come in size. But they really want to make sure that the compliance and reporting is there. It's you know, in any asset class, if it's public stocks, it's the SEC, right, with Edgar. So that you have under any new asset class the need for compliance and reporting. So we believe for zones to be ultimately very successful, that must be in place. Number two, the reporting requirements, we believe, will help spread best practices, right? So if you know what's happening in a sector or a region, you can say, okay, what were the impacts? You know, what happened to incomes? You know, what happened to other aspects that you want to spread? So without information, it doesn't happen. The pending law will also have reporting requirements for QOZBs, the businesses, which we believe is positive. So right now, the only reporting requirements are really at the QOF level. You know, after the investor makes the investment, we believe it's very positive that businesses also then can help explain the impact they're having. And that would be something that would, again, allow businesses to understand best practices. And the law is going to really allow large investment flows to come in because they'll have the confidence that it's a compliant investment and it has the impact that the law was intended to advance. One aspect I'll also say, Catherine, that there's a fund of funds plank to the law, which is fairly technical, but an investor, if passed, the law will allow to invest in a fund of funds that will then invest in other funds. We believe that's very positive, and that the fund of funds will allow reporting and compliance because they'll be targeting communities that may not be getting capital, they're too small. They'll also be, again, spreading best practices. So we think this law is phenomenally positive. It's bipartisan. And it really allows the law, I think, to really scale to where it should help America.
Thanks so much, Al. And just in our efforts to advance that legislation, we met recently with numerous Senate offices. So just to reiterate the conversation that happened right after Howard's presentation about the need for stories and the need for those stories to filter to policymakers, that was the kind of dominant theme or takeaway, I think, from those meetings, was the staffers, the senators, they want to hear about the great work happening on the ground, you know, in the states they represent, but just generally with the policy as well. So just wanted to reiterate the points made there by Howard and Rachel about how important that is, and not only in service of passing this legislation that is, you know, current and something that we're pushing for, but just generally for the overall perception of the policy and understanding of the policy and how it's working, you know, in real time. That's hugely important as well. So just wanted to reiterate that and ground that in some recent conversations we had on the Hill, specifically asking for that type of information. So that is something we can help facilitate too. If you have interesting projects, if you'd like to connect with, you know, your member of Congress or your senator, and share that information, that's something that we can absolutely help with. And I can make sure that everyone has my email if you are interested in doing that.
Thanks, Catherine. I got another question for Howard that was given by direct chat. So Howard, are you only working with Arcturus, or are you interested in helping other QOFs complete similar assessments?
Oh, very glad you asked. So we so far, Arcturus is the only QOF that we are currently working with, but we are always interested in working with other investors to do the kind of work that we've been doing with Arcturus. So please reach out to us. I can put our information, my information in the chat as well.
It sounds great. Thank you, Howard. Any other questions for Al or Howard? I'll leave it open for a few seconds. Catherine, I'm not sure if you're seeing anything else on your end.
I am not, but I am about to put Al and Howard, if you don't mind, I'm going to put your email information in the chat, as I'm not sure.
Please do. Yeah.
Thanks. I was just typing it in myself.
Okay, great.
Happy if you do it.
I guess, Howard, I have another question for you. I know you kind of went over the metrics for the Arcturus portfolio deals, but was there anything surprising, going into it? I know you don't want to make assumptions about the impact, but did anything surprise you after you completed your analysis that you wanted to really point out to Arcturus and say, this is a big deal?
Well, one thing which they recognized was a big deal was just how well their companies did during the pandemic. How they weathered the pandemic. They not only survived, but in many cases thrived.
Yeah, and something you mentioned was that at the beginning of your engagement with Arcturus, you really worked side by side with them to understand their impact goals. And I'm assuming those goals were established as part of the overall investment thesis of the fund. And so just to reiterate how important it is, if you want to perhaps conduct this sort of analysis, that maybe you're identifying those impact goals or desired outcomes at the front end and using an impact screen to evaluate deals. I think that's really important and helpful. But Howard, what about someone who just started to make investments, maybe didn't have an impact screen in mind? Can they still also do an impact evaluation?
They certainly can. We can work with them to help clarify their goals, turn those goals into metrics that are measurable, and then put those into a survey in a way that companies will be able to respond. And you might think that this is an easy process, but it actually takes quite a bit of work on the part of both the QOF manager and us at ICIC in order to get it right.
Rachel, could I just speak on that issue for a second? One interesting fact pattern we've seen in the market is people have a hard time measuring impact, and they really don't want to be part of a larger platform where they don't, have decision-making power on where they go and who they support. So we're very happy to help any investor set up their own vehicle. It could be a LLC, could be a C Corp, could be a S Corp, and then have Capstone Analytics really help that investor find investments to fill up that platform, kind of an SMA, separately managed account. It's a unique approach in the market, we believe, but it's very important because people want to be able not just to measure it, but to make it happen. So if you have a certain view of impact the way you want to do it, and you have the gains to drive it, Capstone Analytics will help that happen. So we'll create a tailored approach, both in your vehicle and also with your own gains and flow of projects, because we're opening up now a Rockville, Maryland office. We're always in zones. We're a pure play zone firm, but our DC area office will be working a lot with the federal and state and local community members who really want to attract capital their certain ways. So we really think that what zones do is allow the tailored personalization of the investment world, which is, again, unique, and will help that happen for any investors.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a great point. And I think it goes to probably the final question here, is whether or not you're seeing any QOF sponsored by nonprofit entities. I can think of one, but I'm thinking, Al, that the services you're providing would make entry into the marketplace a lot easier for, say, a nonprofit organization that wants to do high impact work.
Rachel, that's a very, very good point. We've been actually approached by some very large foundations and endowments who are not taxpayers who want to set up their own QOF. And we asked, well, you're not a taxpayer. They go, well, we want to have two things happen. Number one, measure the impact of our investments, and zones can do that uniquely. And number two, amplify the effect of our dollars. So if we come in to a QOZB, maybe we are not a taxpayer, but around us, other costs then can come in. So it's really a unique program to allow anywhere in the country, these zones, any sector, any stage. And we see huge interest from non-taxpayers for that measurable, provable ESG. So we think zones will really see with this law passing, and thanks to your good work at EIG, we hope it passes soon. This is really going to transform how America helps these communities.
Well, thank you all both so much. Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
Sure. Well, again, thank you, Al and Howard and Rachel, for leading us in a great discussion. Really appreciated the opportunity to learn more about your work, and thank you for doing it. Thank you to everyone who attended today. Really appreciate your engagement. And just to reiterate what we said at the top, we will have this posted, a recording, the slides, and a recap of the discussion posted on our site. And sent to you all as soon as that is published. So thank you again for joining, and look out for some more details about our next webinar next month. See you then. Thank you.